They thought the stroke had taken my mind. It had only taken the strength out of my left hand and a little of the steadiness in my walk. But I let them go on believing the rest, because the day my wife leaned over my hospital bed and whispered to the man standing behind her, "He won't remember any of this by Christmas," I decided I would remember every single word. I'm 67 years old. I spent 41 years running a marina and boat repair yard on the north shore of a lake most people in this country couldn't find on a map, and I'm not ashamed to say I made it worth something. When I bought the place, it was 3 rotting docks and a bait shack with a leaking roof. When I had the stroke last spring, it was 11 acres of waterfront, a covered slip facility, a fuel dock, a little restaurant I leased out, and enough land along the access road that a developer had already offered me a number with a comma in it that still makes my chest tighten when I think about it. I built that with my own 2 hands and a marriage I thought was a partnership. I was wrong about exactly one of those things. My first wife passed 18 years ago. Cancer. The slow kind. The kind that gives you time to say everything and then takes the person you said it to anyway. We never had children, which is a grief that doesn't make the news but sits with you at the kitchen table every morning for the rest of your life. I was alone for 6 years after that, and I told myself I was fine with it, the way men my age tell themselves a lot of things. Then I met my second wife at a charity dinner for the volunteer fire department. She was 15 years younger than me, sharp and funny, with a laugh that filled a room and a way of looking at me like I was the only interesting thing in it. She had a grown son from a marriage that had gone bad, a boy in his late 20s who she said had lost his way, but had a good heart underneath. I believed that too. I believed a lot of things back then because I wanted to. A man who's been lonely will pour the water in whether or not he checks the cup for cracks. We married 8 years ago. I'm not going to pretend I didn't see small things over the years. The way money seemed to evaporate when her son was around, the credit card bills with charges from towns neither of us had been to, the phone she started carrying face down. But you tell yourself a story, and the story I told myself was that she loved me, and that love doesn't keep a ledger. The morning of the stroke, I'd been splitting wood out behind the workshop. I remember the smell of the cut oak, and the way the light came sideways through the pines. And then I remember the ground coming up at me and my own arm not answering when I told it to break the fall. My wife found me an hour later. The doctor said the hour mattered. They said if she'd found me sooner, the damage might have been less. She told me later, with her eyes shining like she'd just done something brave, that she'd been running errands in town. I found out 4 months after that she'd been at a motel 40 minutes away, and the man she'd been with was the same man who'd been standing behind her in my hospital room. So let me tell you about that man, because he's the third leg of this thing. He came into the picture as my wife's financial planner. That's how she introduced him, about a year before the stroke. He was younger than her, slick in the way that's supposed to read as competent, with a firm handshake and a watch he wanted you to notice. He called me my friend, in a way that made my skin crawl, the way a man does when he's already decided what you are to him, and it isn't a friend. He started coming around to help us organize our affairs for retirement. He'd sit at my kitchen table with spreadsheets and talk about consolidating and simplifying and protecting the estate, and my wife would put her hand on my arm and say, "He's only trying to make things easier for us, honey." I should have thrown him off the property the first afternoon. Instead, I made him coffee. After the stroke, the 3 of them moved fast. I'll give them that. Greed has a kind of energy that honest work never quite matches. The first thing I noticed was the doctor. Not my doctor. The one who treated me at the hospital and signed off that my cognition was intact, that the damage was motor and not mental. A new doctor. My wife said my old physician had retired and that she found someone wonderful who specializes in geriatric care. This new one came to the house. He'd ask me what year it was, who the president was, and then before I could answer, he'd be writing in his pad, like he already knew what he was going to write. The third visit, I watched my wife walk him to his car and hand him an envelope. Not insurance paperwork, a plain white envelope. Thick, The kind you don't get a receipt for. That's when I understood. They weren't going to wait for me to die. They were going to declare me dead while I was still breathing. Now here's the part I want you to understand. Because folks always ask why a man would let himself look weak, why he wouldn't stand up straight and fight. I'll tell you exactly why. Because the moment I let them see I was sharp, they'd have changed the plan. As long as they thought my mind was gone, they got careless. They talked in front of me like I was furniture. They left documents on the counter. They made phone calls in the next room with the door half open. A frightened man fights early and loses. A patient man lets the other side keep talking until they've talked themselves into a corner. I didn't decide to play weak because I was weak. I decided to play weak because it was the only winning move on the board, and I'd spent 40 years fixing other people's broken engines because I'm the kind of man who finds the winning move. So I became the confused old man they needed me to be. I let my speech come out slow and uncertain, even though it had mostly come back. I'd ask the same question twice on purpose. I'd forget where the bathroom was, and let my wife guide me there with that performance of patience she put on whenever her son was watching. I let the new doctor's questions trip me up, and every night, after the house went quiet, I sat at the little desk in the room they'd moved me into. The back room, the cold one. So you can rest, honey. And I wrote everything down in a spiral notebook, in handwriting that nobody would believe came from a man with a ruined mind. What I figured out, over those weeks, was the shape of the whole thing. They were going to file for a conservatorship. They were going to have the bribed doctor testify that I was no longer competent to manage my own affairs. My wife, as my spouse, would be appointed to manage my estate in my best interest. And then her financial planner would do exactly what financial planners like him do, which is move money through a series of accounts until the original owner can't find it and the lawyers give up looking. The marina, the land, the developer's offer with the comma in it, all of it would slide quietly out of my hands and into theirs. And the official record would say it was for my own good. The cruelest part wasn't the money. I want to be honest about that. I've lived without money before, and I'll die without needing much of it. The cruelest part was overhearing my wife on the phone one night, laughing, really laughing, that big room-filling laugh I'd married her for, and saying to whoever was on the other end, No, he's a vegetable now. It's actually perfect. He just sits there. Perfect. That was the word she used about the man who'd given her 8 years of his life and a home she'd never have to leave. Perfect. I sat in that cold back room and I did not cry, though I wanted to. I'd done my crying 18 years earlier in a different room with a different woman, and I'd learned that grief and resolve can't share the same hour, so I chose resolve. The first thing I needed was a witness they didn't know about. The marina had a man who'd worked for me for 22 years, the closest thing to a son I'd ever had. And no, I'm not going to use his name here even now, because he's still alive, and he asked me not to. He'd been kept away from me since the stroke. My wife told him I didn't want visitors, and changed the gate code so his key fob wouldn't work. But he'd been with me long enough to know something was wrong, because in 22 years I'd never once gone 2 weeks without calling him about something. And now it had been 2 months. I needed to reach him without using any phone in that house. Because I'd already learned my calls were being monitored, my wife helpfully kept my cell phone charged in her own purse. So I waited for a Tuesday because on Tuesdays, a young woman from a home care service came to sit with me for 3 hours while my wife went to her book club, which I now knew was a motel room. The home care aide was a kid, maybe 22, working her way through nursing school. She was kind to me in a real way, not a performed way, and she talked to me like I was a person. The third Tuesday she sat with me. I waited until she was making tea in the kitchen, and I let my hand find hers when she set the cup down. And in a clear, quiet, completely unconfused voice I said, I need you to do something for me, and I need you to believe I'm in my right mind, and I'll understand if you can't. She froze. Then she sat down across from me and said, I knew it. I knew there was nothing wrong with you. You watch everybody. Smart kid. I asked her to carry a folded piece of paper out of the house and drop it in a mailbox in town. On it was my old foreman's address and 3 sentences. That I was fine, that I was being set up, and that he should come to the county courthouse on the date of the hearing and bring the box from the back of the parts room. The gray steel box. He'd know the one. She did it. God bless her, she did it, and she never once let on. She kept right on performing patience for my wife while I kept right on performing decline, and we became, the two of us, a small conspiracy of the truth inside a house full of lies. Now about that gray box. Years ago, when I'd first started making real money, my first wife, the one I lost, had made me promise I'd never let the business put us at the mercy of anyone. She'd grown up poor. The kind of poor where you learn that people will take what isn't nailed down. And she made me set things up. So the marina, the land, all of it, was held not in my personal name, but in a trust. A trust I controlled. A trust with a successor structure she and I had drawn up together with a lawyer in the city, far from our little town. I'd half forgotten it over the years. The day-to-day money flowed through ordinary accounts, and that's all my second wife and her planner had ever seen. But the bones of everything I owned were held somewhere they didn't know to look, controlled by a document none of them had ever laid eyes on, with a lawyer they'd never heard of as a named co-trustee in the event of my incapacity. My first wife, 18 years in the ground, was about to reach up and pull the rug out from under the people trying to bury me. I didn't tell anyone. Not the aide, not my foreman, not even the lawyer yet. I sat on it. The way you sit on a full house and let the other man keep betting. The hearing was set for a Thursday in late October. In the weeks leading up to it, the performance in the house got worse because they got bolder. My wife started talking about the developer's offer openly at dinner to her son and her planner. Like I wasn't sitting right there with my spoon in my soup. Once this is finalized, she said, we sign with the developer, we take the lump sum, and we're done with the slake forever. Her son, who I want to remind you I had paid to put through community college and twice bailed out of debt and once out of jail, raised his glass and said, to getting out of here. And the planner, the man who'd called me his friend, looked right at me across the table, gave me a slow smile, and said, to you, my friend, you worked so hard for all this. And then he winked. He actually winked at the man he thought he'd erased. I want you to know I held the spoon steady. I looked at him with the empty eyes of a man whose mind has gone, and inside, behind those eyes, I was as clear and as cold as the lake in January. I thought, keep talking, son. Keep talking, son. Keep talking. The night before the hearing, I couldn't reach my lawyer from the house. So I did the only thing left. The home care aide came that Wednesday. They'd added an extra day because the hearing was close, and my wife wanted me looking cared for. And I gave her one last note, the lawyer's name, the lawyer's number, and a single line. Call her tonight. Tell her client is being railroaded at the county courthouse at 9 a.m. Tell her to come and bring the trust. The aide read it. Her hands were shaking. She looked at me and said, what if it doesn't work? And I told her the truest thing I knew. I said, then at least somebody alive will know I wasn't crazy. She made the call from the parking lot of the gas station on her way home. I found that out later. The morning of the hearing, they dressed me. That's a thing they did, dressing me. That I'll never forget the humiliation of, even though I'd chosen to allow it. My wife picked out an old cardigan with a stain on it and a pair of slacks that didn't fit anymore since I'd lost weight. And she didn't comb my hair so much as paw at it. And she stood me in front of the mirror and said, there. Don't you look comfortable? Comfortable. Comfortable. She wanted me to look like a man who'd given up. Her planner drove. Her son sat in the back with me and spent the whole ride scrolling his phone, never once looking at me, and at one point he muttered, mostly to himself, almost there, old man. Almost there. He had no idea how right he was. The hearing was in a small courtroom on the second floor of the county building. The kind of room with bad fluorescent lighting and chairs that squeak. The judge was a woman near my own age. Judge Ferraro, with reading glasses on a chain and the look of someone who'd seen every variety of human ugliness and was no longer surprised by any of it. My wife's lawyer? They'd hired a real one. A smooth man in a good suit laid it all out. The stroke, the decline, the concern for my welfare. And then he called the doctor. The doctor took the stand and said exactly what the envelope had paid him to say. He said I was disoriented, that I couldn't reliably state the date or my own circumstances, that in his professional opinion I lacked the capacity to manage my affairs and required the appointment of a conservator. My wife dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Her son looked appropriately solemn. Her planner sat in the gallery with his arms crossed, that watch catching the light. And I sat at the table beside an empty chair where my own lawyer should have been, looking down at my hands, playing the part right to the last second. Judge Ferraro looked over her glasses at me and asked, gently, the way you talk to someone you've already decided is gone. Sir, do you understand what's happening here today? And that's when the back door of the courtroom opened. A woman walked in. Priya Nair, the lawyer my first wife and I had hired a lifetime ago. Gray now, where she'd been dark-haired when I last saw her, but with the same flat, unhurried voice, and behind her came my foreman, carrying a gray steel box, and behind him, sitting quietly in the back row where I couldn't even see her until later, the home care aide who'd carried my words out of that house 3 times in her trembling hands. My lawyer didn't rush. She walked to the front, introduced herself to the court, and asked the judge's permission to address a misunderstanding before any order was entered. My wife's lawyer objected. The judge, who I think had smelled something off the moment the doctor's testimony came in just a little too rehearsed, said she'd allow it. And then my lawyer did 3 things, one after another, like she was setting boards in place to walk across. First, she handed up the trust, the original document, with my signature and my first wife's signature and the seal of a firm 200 miles away, and explained to the court that the entire estate the petitioners were seeking to control had not, in fact, belonged to me personally for 19 years. It belonged to a trust with a provision that, in the event of my incapacity, control passed not to my spouse, but to the named co-trustee herself. There was nothing for a conservator to conserve. The petitioners had come to court to be handed the keys to a house they didn't own and never had. Second, she handed up a thick folder and asked the court to take note that the physician who just testified to my incapacity was, as of 2 weeks prior, under investigation by the state medical board for exactly this, for accepting payment to produce competency findings on demand. My lawyer had made calls of her own once the aide reached her the night before. She'd found 2 other families this same doctor had helped strip clean. The judge's face, when she heard that, went very still. And third, this is the part the home care aide had made possible, the part I'd been building toward for 11 weeks in a cold back room. My lawyer asked the court's permission to play a recording, because the aide, smart kid that she was, had started recording her visits weeks earlier, on her own, to protect myself, she said, in case anyone ever accused her of mistreating a patient. And on those recordings, captured plain as day in my wife's own laughing voice, was the sentence, "He's a vegetable now. It's perfect." And her son's voice, "Almost there, old man." And the planners, "You worked so hard for all this," followed by that little wet sound of a wink you can somehow hear if you know to listen for it. The courtroom went absolutely silent. And then I lifted my head. I sat up straight, the way I hadn't let them see me sit up in 3 months. I looked at Judge Ferraro with my own eyes, clear and steady, and I answered the question she'd asked me a full 10 minutes earlier, in a voice that carried to every corner of that squeaking, fluorescent room. "Yes, Your Honor," I said. "I understand exactly what's happening here today. I've understood it from the beginning. I just needed everybody else to say it out loud first. I will not lie to you and tell you I didn't enjoy what their faces did then." My wife's tissue stopped halfway to her cheek. Her son's phone slid out of his hand and hit the floor, and the planner, my friend, stood up like he was going to leave, and a sheriff's deputy by the door put one hand up, palm out, and said, "Have a seat, sir." And the planner sat back down so fast the chair barked against the tile. The judge took her glasses off, set them on the bench, and looked at the three of them for a long, long moment. "I have been on this bench for 22 years, she said finally, "and I have rarely seen anything as openly contemptible as what I have witnessed this morning." She denied the petition from the bench. Then she did something I didn't expect. Something that told me she was angrier than even I was. She held the matter over and ordered all parties to remain while she made some calls of her own. By the end of that day, the district attorney's office had the recordings, the doctor's folder, and the envelope of cash that blessed that home care aide one more time. She had also seen change hands and was willing to swear to. People always want to know the part that comes after the gavel, and I understand why, because a story that ends at the moment of victory feels like a meal with no dessert. So here's the after. The planner went to prison, not for very long by the measure of what he did to people, but long enough, 28 months. And the trial turned up 4 other elderly clients he'd been bleeding, 2 of whom got money back because the investigation he triggered froze his accounts before he could move everything offshore. The doctor lost his license permanently and is facing his own charges in 2 counties. My wife's son took a plea on a conspiracy charge and got probation and a record that I'm told has made it remarkably difficult for him to find anyone willing to hand him their finances, which strikes me as poetic, and my wife. People ask about her most of all. The divorce. Yes, there was a divorce. I filed it myself the following week, and I was clear-headed and well-dressed, and represented by a lawyer for that one, you can be sure. Because the estate was in the trust, she walked away with what the law gave her from our marital accounts. And not 1 inch of the marina, not 1 board of those 11 acres. She got a settlement that was fair and not a penny more, and she did not get the lump sum from the developer who I never did sell to, by the way, because I decided I'd rather keep fixing engines and watching the light come sideways through the pines than take a number with a comma in it and go live somewhere I didn't love. The last I heard, she'd moved 2 states away. She never said sorry. I never expected her to. People who can call a living man perfect because he stopped being useful to them don't have the machinery for sorry. I gave the home care aide enough money to finish nursing school with nothing owed and a little left over, and I told her it wasn't charity. It was the going rate for saving a man's life, which is more than the value of a marina any day. My old foreman runs the repair yard now. Mostly while I do the parts of the work my hand still lets me do, and we've never once talked about that gray box. Because some things between 2 men don't need words. I'm 68 now. My left hand still won't do what I tell it, and my walk is still a little uneven, and there are mornings the bed is cold, and I think about the woman I actually loved, the one who made me promise to protect what we built, and I tell her out loud that I kept the promise. I built it with my own 2 hands. They thought I'd forgotten how to use them. I hadn't forgotten a thing. The thing I keep coming back to on the cold mornings is that none of it would have worked if I'd let my pride do the talking. Every part of me wanted to stand up in that back room and shout that my mind was fine, that I was still the man who built that marina out of 3 rotting docks. That shout would have cost me everything. The day my wife called me perfect because I'd stopped being useful. She told me exactly who she was, and the only sane response to learning who someone truly is to believe them. So I swallowed the shout. I let them think they'd won, and patience, the kind that hurts to hold, turned out to be the only weapon a half-broken old man had left. People want to know how I outsmarted them, like there was some trick. There wasn't a trick. There was just paying attention. They got loud and careless because they were certain I couldn't follow along, and certainty makes people stupid. I wrote down what I saw every night in a notebook nobody believed I could fill. My late first wife had set up that trust 19 years before any of this because she'd grown up watching people take what wasn't nailed down, and she made me promise to nail everything down. Her foresight, sitting quietly in a gray steel box, did more for me than any speech I could have made. That's the part the lover never understood. He thought money was something you grab. It's something you protect, long before you ever need to. But I won't pretend cleverness was enough on its own. There were nights I nearly gave up. Nights the loneliness of that cold room felt heavier than the betrayal. What carried me through wasn't being smart. It was refusing to quit on a Tuesday when quitting would have been so much easier. And it was a 22-year-old home care aide who chose to do the decent thing when looking the other way would have cost her nothing. She didn't have to believe me. She didn't have to carry my words out of that house with shaking hands. She did it because she was raised to know the difference between right and wrong and to act on it even when it scared her. That girl reminded me that character isn't something you announce. It's something you do quietly when no one's keeping score. So if you take anything from an old man who got declared dead while he was still breathing, take this. Guard what's right in you even when no one's watching, because that's the thing they can never seize. Keep your eyes open and your mouth shut a little longer than feels comfortable, because the patient mind sees the whole board. And on the morning you're certain you can't hold on one more day, hold on anyway. The people who tried to bury me are scattered and broken now, and I'm still here, watching the light come sideways through the pines, with both hands on what I built.